It was the summer of 1995, and the Bitterroot Range felt like a vast, sweating oven. We weren't exactly professional backpackers, just two engineering students, myself and Mike, hired by some low-budget geological survey outfit to map mineral deposits that probably didn't exist. The pay was decent, the isolation was total, and the heat was a constant, shimmering headache. For days in, we hadn't seen a soul, only the jagged teeth of the mountains cutting the sky and the relentless, high-pitched whine of flies. My shoulders felt permanently bowed under the steel frame of my pack, the nylon straps chafing skin already slick with the metallic taste of dried sweat. Mike, bless his cotton socks, was surviving on instant coffee and Marlboro Reds, smelling perpetually of smoke and desperation. He was the nervous type, the kind who watched too many late-night documentaries, and he'd been jumpier than usual since we crossed the Salmon River drainage. "I'm telling you, this is the spot," Mike muttered, dropping his pack with a dull thud that kicked up a cloud of pulverized pine needles. His face was sunburned crimson, his eyes sunk deep with fatigue. The old man in Lowell, the one with the missing fingers? He said this valley, called it the Deadfall Gulch, was bad ground. Too many game trails going nowhere, too much silence. I ignored him, pulling out the dehydrated beef jerky that tasted exactly like salted cardboard. Mike always leaned into the local legends, filling the overwhelming vacuum of silence with stories of things that walked upright and smelled like damp earth and ozone. I attributed it to the lack of nicotine patches and too much high-altitude anxiety. The silence was oppressive, though. The woods weren't empty. They were holding their breath. Even the usual chatter of jays and squirrels had been replaced by a heavy, almost humid quiet that pressed against the eardrums. We were making camp beside a trickle of a creek, one of the few reliable water sources we had marked on the outdated topographical maps. As I started to clear a space for the tent, Mike suddenly stopped fiddling with his lighter. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring across the narrow stream, deep into a thicket of spruce and brush so dense you couldn't push a rabbit through it. The smell hit me then, not ozone, but something ranker, musky and slightly spoiled, like old meat left in a cellar. "Hey, come look at this," Mike whispered, his voice thin and unnaturally steady. I walked over, stepping around a cluster of smooth river stones, and followed his gaze. There, where the undergrowth should have been impenetrable, was a clearing. It wasn't a deer path. It was a swath, maybe 3 feet wide, cut cleanly through the dense young trees. The cut wasn't made by an axe or a saw. The edges were ragged and broken, the small spruces bent backwards and snapped near the ground, stripped of their lower branches. It looked like something huge, something heavy, had just walked directly through the brush, ignoring the pain and the resistance. And then I saw the detail that made my stomach clench. Embedded high up in the rough bark of a 6-foot-tall Douglas fir, far above where any bear could reach, were 3 distinct parallel gashes, deep enough to expose the pale wood beneath, smeared faintly dark with something that wasn't sap. It looked less like claw marks and more like fingers had pressed and dragged, hard, leaving a signature behind. I pulled my hand back instinctively. The dark smear wasn't sap. It was too viscous, almost granular, and it smelled faintly of iron and damp wool. My partner, Gary, a pragmatic man who trusted only what the Forest Service manuals taught him, edged closer. He reached out, hesitated, and then wiped a bit of the stuff with the tip of his thumb. "What the hell is that?" Gary muttered, his voice unnaturally loud in the sudden, oppressive silence. He was right. The forest had gone utterly mute. A second ago, we had the comforting, constant chatter of Steller's jays and the distant rush of the creek echoing up from the valley floor. Now, nothing. The ambient noise floor had dropped to 0. Even the high-frequency whine of insects stopped. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. It felt like the air itself had thickened, refusing to carry sound. And the temperature. It felt like someone had thrown open the door to a meat locker. That damp, bone-aching chill settled in my sinuses, far colder than the elevation or the time of day warranted. We stood frozen by the fir, necks craned toward the unnaturally high scratch marks, the feeling of being intensely scrutinized crawling over my skin. Then, from maybe 70 yards down the slope, hidden within a thicket of old-growth cedar, came the sound. It wasn't a branch snapping under weight, nor the wind shifting heavy deadfall. It was a singular, massive thud, It sounded wet and solid, like a sack of concrete hitting packed earth, followed by a low, resonant, hollow echo that seemed to vibrate in the soles of my boots. Gary shifted his rifle strap, trying to look bored, trying to deny the immediate knot of alarm tightening in his gut. Bear, probably. Just crashing through the brush. Happens all the time. He was lying, and we both knew it. Bears don't make that sound, and bears don't leave deep vertical scratches 6 feet high on a tree trunk. Before I could challenge him, the air changed again. The sudden chill was aggressively displaced by a foul warmth, a sickening mixture that immediately overwhelmed the clean scent of pine and earth. It was ammonia, stale sweat, and something undeniably organic, like a butcher shop floor left uncleaned for a week. It hit my nostrils like a physical punch, forcing a painful gag reflex. It was overwhelming, dense, and close. Too close. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the stench, but the dense, fog-like scent just hung in the air, directionless. And that's when the sound came back, softer this time, closer, less of a jarring thud and more of a deliberate, slow, heavy knock. It definitely wasn't on wood. It sounded like something rhythmic, tapping gently, methodically, against dry bone, and it was moving in parallel with us, just out of sight behind the veil of the remaining shadows. We had lost the path, and whatever had dragged its fingers through that bark was now playing a game of call and response. We pushed harder, faster, stumbling over roots we usually noticed but now ignored entirely. The bone tapping stopped eventually, hours later, but the silence it left behind felt heavier, pressurized, like standing under deep water. We knew we were still off trail, heading generally east, but every cardinal direction felt wrong. That night was the first time Mark snapped. He kept insisting we should have brought a satellite phone, even though they were prohibitively expensive and relatively new technology back in '95. He paced the perimeter while James and I set up the single tent. We figured huddling together was the only way to retain sanity. Mark didn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, clutching the hatchet he'd brought for firewood, his eyes darting into the impenetrable blackness like startled insects. The air was too cold, too still. The usual night sounds, the high-pitched buzz of insects, the rustle of pine needles, the deep sigh of the wind, were absent, replaced by a deep, unnatural quiet that made my ears ring. Around 2 a.m., it started again. Not the rhythmic tapping this time, but movement. Heavy, slow footfalls, not quite bipedal, crushing the damp earth just outside the radius of the dying embers. It sounded like something massive dragging its weight and occasionally planting a flat, enormous foot down. I held my breath, tasting the stale, metallic tang of adrenaline in the back of my throat. Then came the scratching. Not surface scratching against bark, but deep, tearing noises, like thick claws raking across granite or maybe a downed, hollowed log. It was coming from 2 directions now, flanking the meager protection of our tent. James elbowed me, his breathing shallow and quick. Mark, outside, didn't move. He was utterly silent, too silent, a statue of vigil. I heard a low, guttural exhalation, wet and hot, immediately followed by the most chilling sound of all. It was auditory mimicry. A faint, strained whisper, high-pitched, almost feminine, calling James's name. James. It was wrong, distorted, like a sound stretched through old, dried leather, and delivered with a terrible, calculated pause between syllables. James squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head, refusing to acknowledge the impossible familiarity of the sound. The sun eventually rose, painting the forest floor in thin, gray light, but it brought no relief. Mark was the problem now. He hadn't slept for nearly 40 hours. He stopped talking about hiking out and started talking only about it. He was obsessed with the scratching sounds, claiming they were communications, patterns designed to be followed. He spent the entire morning examining the perimeter, finding nothing substantial, but his eyes were bloodshot and manic. He told us he thought it was trying to teach us something. He stopped drinking water, claiming the stream was now contaminated by whatever scent marked the creature. He kept staring into the woods where the whisper came from, nodding slowly, a disturbing, fixed half-smile plastered on his face. He kept whispering that the dark place behind the shadows wasn't empty. It was merely waiting for the signal. The fear was becoming contagious, but Mark wasn't afraid anymore. He seemed almost expectant, The worst part was finding his journal trapped with a monster outside and one possibly turning into one inside. The journal slipped from my numb fingers, landing softly on the damp floor of the tent. The silence Mark had imposed upon himself was heavy, suffocating. He was sitting cross-legged, facing the entrance flap, his back rigid, and he hadn't blinked since I finished reading his insane message. I could feel the cold radiating off the ground, seeping through the cheap nylon floor, but a different heat began to bloom on my skin, the flush of pure, unprocessed dread. Then the scratching returned, but it wasn't the rhythmic tapping on the earth this time. It was loud, abrasive, and right beside us. It was something thick and heavy dragging across the tent fabric itself, accompanied by a smell that hit me like a physical blow. A heavy, suffocating mix of wet earth, rancid musk, and something sour, like spoiled, unwashed rot left too long in the sun. My eyes watered and my stomach clenched, fighting the urge to vomit the last remnants of the pathetic trail mix we'd shared hours ago. The entire tent shuddered, not from wind, but from a deliberate, enormous pressure applied to the side seam, inches from Mark's head. The thread snapped taut, sounding like tiny gunshots in the oppressive silence. The darkness outside wasn't just the deep woods anymore. It resolved itself into a solid, towering silhouette pressed against the orange nylon. It was impossibly wide, blocking out the meager sliver of moonlight filtering through the dense canopy. I remember seeing a massive convex curve where its face must have been, maybe 8 feet off the ground, and 2 denser, darker patches that could only be eyes staring through the thin material, utterly fixed on us. Then came the sound that shattered whatever fragile reality I had left, a deep, visceral, rumbling inhalation, followed by an explosive, hot spray of air and spittle that hit the nylon right in front of Mark. The sound was too loud, too close, too knowing to be just an animal. It ripped, slowly, agonizingly, horizontally across the tent wall, a wet, loud RRRIP that smelled instantly of ozone and decay. The tent wall bowed inwards, and a huge, black-furred appendage, thick as a telephone pole, plunged into the interior. It wasn't searching blindly. It moved with chilling, brutal precision. Mark didn't flinch. He let out a low, satisfied sigh just as the massive hand clamped down on his shoulder, tearing the fabric of his shirt. The strength was immediate and absolute. Mark was yanked backward, his body folding unnaturally as he was dragged through the freshly torn slit in the tent. There was no struggle, no scream, just the sickening wet sound of meat tearing and the heavy thud of his body being pulled into the cold, black dirt outside. I was left paralyzed, soaked in adrenaline, staring at the flapping tier where Mark had been. My senses registered only one thing: colossal, malicious intent. It wasn't fear of death that choked me. It was the terrifying, primal understanding that Mark was the willing sacrifice, and whatever took him was only just beginning its feast. I could hear the heavy, shuffling gait retreat into the woods, dragging something large and broken behind it, and all I could do was taste the metallic tang of blood in my own mouth, wondering how long until it decided to come back for dessert. I didn't run, I stumbled. My body felt heavy, disconnected from the command center in my skull. Every frantic step down the logging path was a prayer whispered through clenched teeth. I kept my gaze fixed on the faint, rusted curve of the Ford Ranger parked 200 yards away. The only sound now was the ragged shriek of my own breathing and the crunch of gravel under my boots, sounds too loud, too careless in the vast, waiting silence of the Idaho woods. I threw myself against the driver's side door, wrenching it open. The smell of stale coffee and old vinyl hit me, briefly familiar, terribly grounding. Keys. Where were the damn keys? They were tethered to my belt loop, thank God. My hands, slick with cold sweat and something else, maybe Mark's blood, shook so violently I missed the lock cylinder twice. Finally, the key went in. I twisted it. Click, chick, chick, chick. The starter motor groaned, a weak, sickly complaint, but the engine didn't catch. My stomach bottomed out. No, not now. I tried again, grinding the key harder, praying to a God I hadn't acknowledged since I was 10. Click, chick, chick, chick. Just that pathetic whine, mocking my survival instinct. I pressed the gas pedal once, twice, flooding the engine, a panicked amateur move. The silence that followed the futile starting attempts was worse than any roar. And then, I heard it. Not the distant, rhythmic shuffle that took Mark. This was closer. Heavy, wet footsteps crushing the needle floor of the forest, moving parallel to the road, closing the gap. It was circling. I hammered the key again, holding my breath, forcing focus. The engine sputtered, caught itself in a rough, vibrating idle, threatening to die instantly. I slammed the gear shift into drive, ignoring the grinding protest of the cold transmission, and mashed the accelerator. The tires spun briefly on the loose gravel, spitting debris into the night. As the Ranger bucked forward, my high beams illuminated the road ahead. And that's when the final, paralyzing obstacle presented itself. It wasn't a shadow or a suggestion. It was a massive, wet-looking form, easily 10 feet tall, planted squarely in the middle of the narrow logging road, silhouetted against the dark pines. It wasn't moving, just standing there, a physical wall of muscle and matted fur. The sheer, colossal density of it robbed the air from the cab. My brain registered not an animal, but a monumental, terrible intelligence fixed solely on me. Its head was low, perhaps smelling the vehicle, perhaps simply waiting. I screamed, a sound swallowed instantly by the roaring engine. There was no time to brake, nowhere to turn. Instinct took over. I swerved the wheel violently to the right, aiming the entire mass of the pickup truck off the logging road and directly into the dense, black tree-line. I felt the sickening lurch of the tires tearing through bushes, the crunch of small saplings snapping like bones, followed by the deafening, ripping metallic scream as the passenger side scraped against a boulder, ripping the door completely off its hinges. The truck kept going, blindly charging deeper into the woods, the sound of the engine deafening, until the entire world became a violent, jarring collision of steel and earth. And then, mercifully, nothing. And then, mercifully, nothing. I woke up choking on pulverized glass and the sour, metallic taste of my own blood mixed with engine oil. The world had stopped spinning, but it was listing heavily to the right. Hours passed, I don't know how many, before I managed to drag myself out of the wreck. My left leg was useless, a sack of loose, burning ligaments, but the adrenaline was a cruel, hot syrup in my veins, forcing me to move. I didn't see the thing again, but the air still held that distinct, dreadful smell, like ozone mixed with wet, poorly cured hides. I crawled, then stumbled, using shattered bits of the doorframe as crutches, for 2 days before a group of hunters found me, mistaking me for a derelict until they saw the state of the canyon where the Ford finally came to rest. There were 5 of us that started the hike. Only 3 of us made it back to the civilization that mattered. I was physically patched up, stitches, pins, and months of physiotherapy. Mark, however, was another matter entirely. They found him nearly 3 miles downriver, fully exposed, babbling about the smell and the wrongness of the shadows. He's institutionalized now, in a quiet, sterile facility upstate. He doesn't speak. He just scratches thick, rhythmic patterns onto the wall with his thumbnail until his fingers bleed. He doesn't remember the truck, the headlights, or the moment it hit. He only remembers the silence that followed and the feeling of something looking back. Sarah and Jim were officially listed as missing, presumed lost to the harsh environment of the Bitterroot Mountains. The police were patient, but their faces were mirrors of absolute disbelief. They kept bringing up the empty whiskey bottle we'd foolishly packed. They kept asking about drugs. They wanted to know why I had tried to drive a truck into solid woods at 80 miles an hour. When I tried to articulate the massive, silent, black figure that smelled like the bottom of a swamp and moved like the ground tearing itself open, the sheriff simply wrote psychological trauma in thick blue ink across the top of his report. They found no tracks larger than a deer's, no biological evidence, just a heavily damaged vehicle, negligence, and hysteria. They think they closed the case, but the case is burned into my nerve endings. I live in cities now, in apartment buildings with 3 deadbolts and a view of concrete, miles away from anything that smells like pine. But the silence, that awful, crushing silence of the deep woods, still finds me. I wake up in the dark, checking the locks, convinced the sheer bulk of it is standing outside my window. I look in the mirror and see a man with hollowed-out eyes and a permanent tremor, a man who knows that the wilderness is not empty space. It's not gone. It didn't leave. It just finished its meal and settled back down. It's waiting for the forest to grow back